Coming up, as climate change brings conflagration to California and Oregon, one of Wall Street's most respected leaders says there are ways to use the markets to address one of the most pressing issues of our age. Former head of Goldman Sachs and Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson.
The private sector can do its part, but without a change in government policies, the private sector is not going to be able to take care of it.
This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg.
Let us not forget one fundamental issue which lies at the heart of our problems. Over a period of years, persistent and growing global imbalances fueled a dramatic increase in capital flows, low interest rates, excessive risk-taking, and a global search for return. These excesses cannot be attributed to any single nation.
That was Hank Paulson speaking as Treasury Secretary back at the height of the financial crisis in 2008. Hank has now moved on to another crisis, one that he sees as potentially much, much greater than the downturn 12 years ago. It's what he calls the dramatic extinction episode we're experiencing and the threat to the biodiversity of the planet. But given his experience, it's no surprise that he thinks the markets themselves can and should be brought to bear. And with the help of government, turn things around by making biodiversity itself investable.
There's an alarming destruction of biodiversity, forests, wetlands, prairies around the world. And as you said, a staggering extinction episode, which I think has really grave, implications for humanity in terms of prosperity and the well-being of people on Earth. Now, we're just and to put some parameters around this extinction episode, that it's playing out at 1,000 times the normal level, which means that rather than losing 1 to 5 species a year, we're losing a lot. And, if this continues unabated, we'd lose, half of the animals and plants on Earth by mid-century. And, this would have an enormous economic impact. Now, we're just in the early stage, and, scientists and economists are in the very early stage of being able to quantify and measure the magnitude of what this means economically. But one thing we know for sure, the best way to hedge against these risks is to invest in nature. And the problem we've had for some time is our economic systems don't really measure nature. They don't account for the value of the services provided by the natural world. And that's because we have market failures. These services and nature is treated as a free good. And so that means that those who invest in it to conserve it aren't appropriately rewarded. Those who destroy it aren't appropriately penalized.
Can the markets take care of this on their own? We now have a lot of ESG funds. BlackRock's got a big one. Various people have big. Goldman Sachs, by the way, you may have heard of them. They have one as well. Could the private sector by itself take care of this?
No way. As a matter of fact, one of the findings, which is very clearly, was that the private sector can do its part, but without a change in government policies, the private sector is not going to be able to take care of it. And, one of the things that's been clear to me over many years in terms of advocating for conservation, you need to get government to act, and government's not going to act without broad public support, broad business support. And to do that, you need to make the economic case. And the private sector has a lot of money that can flow into this area. What the government has to create the conditions for that capital to come in, has to create the proper incentives and financing mechanisms. So we lay out a number of those mechanisms or change the subsidies. Or the other, I think one thing that the private sector could do that wouldn't cost a lot, it would make a big difference, and that we talk about in the report, is a different approach looking at the risks in the financial sector around investing and lending. And if banks throughout the world had screens, environmental protection screens, looking at the practices and principles and risks, and avoided funding harmful projects and infrastructure projects and making sure there was planning done in advance, this would make a big difference. This would make a huge difference.
Is it particularly difficult to make that economic case right now when we do have something of a global recession? We don't know, I think, where we are. Where do you think we are in terms of the strength of the economy, domestically as well as around the world? Can we sustain the sort of investment you're talking about?
Okay, so I'm going to make 2 points. In terms of where we are, this is a very serious challenge, much more significant than what we faced during the 2008 financial crisis, because we're dealing with a disease plus the economic impact. And a lot of your question is going to be determined by our ability to control the disease, no doubt about it. But I think the government came in very early, and I was very pleased with the leadership from Stephen Mnuchin working with members of Congress on both sides of the aisle to come up with a very expansive, fiscal program, a stimulus program. I was very pleased with what you saw out of the Federal Reserve. We staved off disaster. More needs to be done.
Can this be addressed without the two largest economies coming together, that is U.S. and China? Because right now we seem to be at loggerheads with China. You know China terribly well. Is there any possibility of a rapprochement that could help us address issues like this together?
Now, in terms of your question about the U.S. and China, this is a very difficult relationship right now. And, it's escalating downward at a dangerous rate. We're dealing with a very different China right now. The views toward China have really hardened among Republicans and Democrats, much, much tougher on China. And I think they need to be. But we need to be smart about what we do. And we need to make sure that while we identify the areas where we have differences with China, where there are conflicts, we figure out how to deal with those and how to manage those while not precluding the opportunity and the need to work together to solve global problems.
That was former Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson.